Hey everyone, it's Lucid. I'm going to be doing the next part in our multiplayer guide series on Pretender design. And in this, my goal is to teach you how to roleplay as a giant wave with crab claw horns, or as a Medusa with dogs for legs. And how with these powerful genetic mutations, eventually, one day, thousands of years from now, you'll have demons and merfolk alike going door to door asking, "Have you found crabby claws yet?" Yeah, we're going to talk about Pretender design, and there's a few things to consider. Basically, Pretender design is a trade-off between a few things. One of the things you're going to get is the chassis, which you get to pick from this list. You have the Immobiles, the Titans, the Awake Expanders, and the Rainbows, as kind of broad categories for the chassis. Those, combined with the types of paths you put on them, will determine how useful each of those chassis are, in combination with when they are spawned. Are they spawned at the beginning of the game, partially way through, or well into mid-game? One thing you're going to balance, like the actual unit you get with your Pretender. The other thing you're trying to balance is the Bless. If you have very good sacred units, you want to give them a Bless, which is going to help them in combat. And blesses can be very, very powerful and stack multiplicatively. You can build up all sorts of, defensive traits on units, like you can stack defense and quickness, and they will have very high defense, or they'll be very hard to hit, or combine defense and ethereal, and they'll be very hard to hit. And you can stack all sorts of offensive things too, like quickness and strength buffs. Blesses can become very powerful. But it's all dependent on the types of sacreds your nation has and how many of them you can get. So that's the other thing to balance, is the Bless. The final thing to balance, of course, is the scales. And the scales are basically going to be how much income do you get from your lands, both in terms of gold, in terms of resources to produce more units, and in terms of magic gems. And it's also going to affect the random events your lands will get. Also, how high or how strong your dominion is, which will affect other things like sacred recruitment, etc. So, those are the three things to balance: your scales, your Bless, and your chassis, and when your chassis becomes awake, whether it's awake, dormant, or imprisoned. And with that, let's get into what we're actually going to talk about in this guide, which are, what are the different types of Pretenders? What are the kind of archetypes? When would you use each of those types, depending on the nation you're playing? And now, once you've decided on the type you're going to get, how do you optimize that choice by picking your magic and your Bless and your scales? Without further ado, let's get into it. The first type we're going to talk about, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to kind of bring up a type, and then we'll talk about when you use it. And then we'll have some kind of things at the end where we talk about how you optimize a given Bless or Pretender or anything like that. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Incarnate Bless Expander. Okay, so what is that? There's certain Blesses that, if you want them, like for water, these ones down here are Incarnate Blesses. And what that means is you need to have an awake god for these to exist. So if your god gets killed, this part of your Bless disappears. If your god hasn't spawned yet, this part of your Bless is not active. Now you can, if your god dies, you can call your god back, but it's going to take several turns, and during that time your army will be the weaker. So for an Incarnate Bless Expander, what you're doing is you're combining two things. One is you're combining usually a very strong Bless, which will require your god to be awake, which you want your sacreds to have at the very beginning of the game. So like quickness is a classic one. We'll pick Lanka, and this is kind of a build you can do with Lanka. Pick a Frost Dragon, and we're going to go up to water 10, and then we're going to pick quickness. And this will give, because we're going to be awake, two things at the beginning. One is we'll have this dragon who's water 10 and has quite good stats and is very capable of expanding. Though it's not maybe the best expander, it can definitely do it. And then we are going to combine that with the scales that we pick, which in this case we are going to tank Turmoil and Productivity some. Maybe we can get away with not fully tanking it. Do Growth, because Lanka is a blood nation. We're going to tank Magic, and then we're going to see, I think we want a point or two of luck. So I think we might. There's some synergy between going Turmoil and Luck at the same time, because they both impact events. Turmoil is going to give you more events, so you want better luck scales if you take it. So you could do something like this. This isn't really optimal, but the goal of this is Lanka actually can struggle a little bit with expansion. They have very good sacred troops, but at the beginning you're going to be very resource constrained, so you're generally going to make these ones which don't take as many resources, and you're going to have some pretty high attrition with them. Later, by the time you actually can start cranking out your higher resource ones, which actually have pretty good protection and don't take that much attrition, expansion's going to be nearing the end. So having an Awake Dragon will help you clear out your cap circle faster, which will allow you to get to lower attrition units sooner, which will allow you to have a much better early game expansion. These are the things to think about when you take an Incarnate Bless Expander. Basically, you want a unit that's going to help you clear out your cap circle so that you can get your better units, your better sacreds that are going to be resource intensive usually earlier. When you do not need an Awake Expander is when you're not going to be resource constrained to get your sacred units out, and when getting those units out, you're going to be able to expand plenty fast without having the need for your Pretender. Now, the other thing to consider is Awake Pretenders can also function as a safeguard against getting rushed. So if a nation has a particularly nasty bless and they're going to rush and kill you, a Pretender can function as a kind of holdfast against that. And the reason why I say getting rushed is that your Pretenders are going to suffer a severe penalty being an enemy dominion, where it's usually very difficult to rush the enemy with your own Pretender, whereas they get a bonus in friendly dominion. So basically, Pretenders are a defensive weapon against getting rushed. But depending on who you're fighting, they can still get chopped to pieces, so also that's dependent on the bless you take. That said, if you're taking an Incarnate Bless, there's a good chance that you are the person with the nasty sacreds that are going to be rushing someone else. So you do not always need that actual kind of Awake Expander. Usually when you do an Awake Expander, you're going to be selecting from this list. You're going to get things with a Dominion 2. They are the Expander chassis. What's significant about these chassis is that they generally have better base combat stats than any other unit. These guys all have horrible combat stats. These guys have okay combat stats, but they're usually somewhat limited. Like in this case, you can see the Devi of Darkness. Yeah, you could see how she could be really good, but she's not quite there. Like the protection's not quite high enough. Yeah, she has fear. It would be kind of good. And you could see how once she casts Stone Skin on herself or some other thing, she would be very strong in combat, but she's not really there yet. And that's kind of it. These chassis are very good out of the box. Like this guy, once you get his Earth high enough, he's going to have very high protection. He's got recuperation, so if you take afflictions in battle, he doesn't care. He has twice as many HP points as the Devi, and he has trample, so he's going to kill things very quick. And then he has berserk, which is going to also add to his protection. Things in here, and like this guy has regeneration, so if they can't damage him fast enough, and he has fear, then he's just going to eventually kill, whatever he's fighting. So anyway, these guys in general are better expansion chassis, and these are generally who you're going to pick if you go for an Incarnate Bless Expander. This will, however, limit you because these guys have the highest new magic path cost. So you're basically almost always going to be limited to the magic paths that are built into each of these chassis. It's very expensive to get a magic path that isn't built in. So if you want a quickness bless, there's only a few chassis you can pick from that are going to have water. I think with this guy, yeah, it's the worm. For this nation, you could get the worm or you could get the frost dragon. And I think that's it for water. Yeah, it is. So yeah, you're going to be pretty limited in the bless you get. You can do a double bless. Like for this guy, we could do something with earth and nature. Let's go ahead and pick out, like you could do Buckskin and Fortitude. So you don't have to only get one. But generally, you're not going to pick a bless which doesn't come on the built-in paths because it would just be too expensive. Look what's going to happen to my design points if I decide to take a minor air bless. Right, this would even just be minor, right? So it would give me major shock resistance. It's going to cost me 150 design points. Anyway, you're probably not going to want to pick up any of the other paths if you use one of these expander chassis. So that's good. I think we've covered when you pick this chassis. You're going to pick it on nations that need to clear out their cap circle, are very resource constrained at the beginning, and then also which are going to struggle to hit 15 to 20 provinces in first year expansion without having an Awake Expander. The next thing we're going to talk about now is an Awake Incarnate Bless, but this time on a researcher or caster. So on one hand, when you get a really good bless, why not put it on an expander because they can run around and get one province a turn for you for all of the early game? You might as well. Well, there are reasons not to. And one of the reasons not to is because if you go for a very good bless, like let's say we do Regeneration and Blood Vengeance, then this is a very good bless and we can have it awake. and we can actually have it with not horrible scales. But if we do this, we are going to have a pretty weak economy. I mean, our income's going to get hit pretty hard, and having a pretender just sit there and research is going to give you lots of key research in the early game, whereas normally you would be very behind in research when you take an Incarnate Bless because you have bad scales. Your cap's going to give you less income. All the provinces you take are going to give you less income. And sure, your sacreds are going to be better, and they may be even more, efficient per dollar spent on sacreds because they're so much better because of the bless. Things like forts are going to be more expensive because you're just going to have less money. Some of that will be made up for by the fact that you expand really well. Anyway, if you're going to be a little slower in the research game with an Awake Bless, getting an Awake Researcher actually is a great way to dodge that. Because this guy, when he's sitting around, he's probably going to be about 40 research a turn, and just having him turn 1 do 40 research, you'll be the research leader for the first probably 2 years. Though after 2 years, you'll quickly fall behind unless you have very good infrastructure behind it. This is kind of an archetype. You get an Incarnate Bless, you have your god come awake early, but a lot of times if you do this, you're going to get one of the Immobiles, which are very cheap. The Immobiles do not punish you as much as other chassis for picking new magic paths. Like in this case, it's only going to be 40 for a new path. So you can totally do something like I just showed you with the Fountain of Blood, where you get a Blood Bless and then also a Nature Bless, like this. It does not punish you that much for this, so you can do something like that. And they also start with higher Dominion, so it makes the overall cost of your build somewhat cheaper. Next, we're going to talk about the National Defender, right? So we've talked about basically, there's only 2 ways to go with Incarnate Bless. Well, okay. Lumped into the Incarnate Bless is you can also use one of these chassis down here. Generally, I don't want to say generally. While you can use them, if you want to get up to a reasonably high Dominion, which you're usually going to want to if you have an Incarnate Bless, because this is going to determine how many of your troops, your sacred troops, you can recruit turn 1. The Dominion ends up being very expensive to get high Dominion with these guys. You have to be careful about getting the Rainbow chassis. If you can find the exact bless you want on one of the Immobiles, it's usually going to be a better value. But if you can't, it's always worth checking these guys out. They're usually not going to be very far behind from how much it would cost to do it on an Immobile. And you do have the benefit that they can move around and they have more inventory spots. So if you want to boost your magic pass later by having them wear certain items, these guys can do it, whereas the Immobiles can't. But the Immobiles themselves are also very hard to kill. So, there's certain things you can do with them, like teleport them around and stuff that make them useful. Anyway, I think we've said enough there. National Defenders. What is a National Defender? A National Defender is pretender you have come online, normally at the end of the first year, so normally you go dormant. They will function to kind of plug holes in things that your empire is missing at around the first year. That sounds very abstract. We'll talk about it here. Let's say, first of all, let's pick a nation you might want to do it on. Let's say Satis. You might choose to do it on Satis. Satis has really good base troops. They do not have very good anti-raiding things other than just putting Skele-spammers in every province. One thing you might want to do is you might want to have somebody that's going to come around and join your armies and do all sorts of fun things. Okay, we'll just use this guy for this example. And why we're picking him in this case is because he has a fair amount of air, and we're going to give him air, fire, and death. And in no ways am I suggesting this is a good build for Satis, but I'll just talk you how to think through it. What this guy is going to do, first of all, you'll notice these are fire and death are very good super combatant paths. Already going to be going enchantment, so this guy can skelly spam if he needs to. He's also going to be able to cloud trapeze, and he's going to do fire shield on himself. And he's a pretty decent chassis. He summons a bunch of scorpions every fight, and he has 95 HP. And the scorpions will basically be a screen while he self-buffs. What you'll do is when this guy comes out, you can see buying this at Dormant, we actually have a kind of a lot of design points to play with, 200, right? So we can still have pretty damn good scales. We could have growth, which is usually pretty good, and then we could take a little bit of this. We'll just pretend the math worked. So this guy's going to come online at the end of the first year, and now he can do some very important things. You can kit him out with good weapons. And good armor. You can have him cloud trapeze onto enemies that are raiding you, because you don't really have great anti-raiding as Satis. And he can, basically every other turn, he can kill a raiding party as long as it can't go stealth and evade him. And that's going to be pretty powerful. And he's going to catch them in, the magic phase. And then for your bless, you could pick out whatever you want. I'm not totally sure what would be best here, but this is kind of standard if you want some kind of super combatant-y thing. And yeah, this would actually be kind of okay because, well, I don't know. Actually, I think your national sacreds have decent base natural protection, so Stygian Flesh probably wouldn't be that good. So I don't know. You would figure it out. But the point is that your national defender is designed to come online at the end of the first year. You're usually going to use one of the Titan chassis because they are very good once they are equipped with items, which you will usually not have when you first spawn at the beginning of the game. Usually you need at least a year to get the research and the gems in order to build your first set of decent items. So you give this guy a Vine Shield, a Horror Helmet, some Reinvigoration items, a good piece of armor, some kind of decent weapon, and you can just have him run around and kill small armies. And that can be very, very powerful in the first year, and it makes you a very unappetizing raiding target. Additionally, this can give you other paths that your nation normally wouldn't have access to, like in the case of Cetis, it gives us very good access to air and fire, and then from that we can summon a bunch of other things. So anyway, those are all things to think about when you're doing your National Defender. You can usually get a kind of light bless out of it, though normally the bless is not the focus. You are going to mostly be doing it for the chassis, to have a very good chassis come online in the mid-game to help cast some key spells for major fights, and to otherwise kill small and medium armies. Okay, so that's the National Defender. Oh, I will say there's another really good National Defender chassis, which I'll just show you real quick, is the Medusa. If you have that in any of your nations, it's definitely worth considering. So I can't remember, Pangaea might be able to get them. Yeah, she can. Okay. So this is the Medusa. It has a petrification attack where anybody near them will basically have a chance of killing themselves when they attack her. While she's not terribly impressive as an Awake Expander, she can be very, very good as a National Defender because you give her some basic items, you have her with some basic alteration research, and then, she casts Regeneration on herself and some other things, and she becomes a just terror. If you're trying to raid into a nation with a Medusa or a Gorgon that could be in any one of the provinces you go to, she's basically going to kill whoever is coming in there, and she can wipe out whole armies, though of course you can counter her once you have appropriate research. But anyway, she's very scary. That's the National Defender. Next we're going to talk about the Rainbow Chassis, the Rainbow Pretender, and there's a few variants we're going to talk about for the Rainbow Pretender. The first one we'll talk about is the Rainbow Imprisoned Pretender. And when do you do a Rainbow Imprisoned Pretender? So first of all, what is one? A Rainbow Imprisoned Pretender is when you get one of these, usually one of the Rainbow Mages, like this, and you're going to go Imprisoned, which, if you notice, I have a ton of design points to play with now. One of the main reasons you go for a Rainbow Imprisoned is so that you can have very good scales, right? So you can end up getting, great scales, and then you still have some left over. So let's get up to like this. What nation are we? Okay, we're Pangaea. So you could do a Rainbow Bless for Pangaea. Pangaea, we know, is going to rely on mass protection, which will make their sacred somewhat weaker, so we can compensate by giving ourselves fire resistance. You can pick whatever chassis you want, but a lot of times you're going to get a few in each of the magic paths. So like in this case, actually, if you want to get bless points, which is one of the reasons that you do a Rainbow Pretender, you need to have at least 4 points in that particular magic path to get a bless. So you can see, if I go down to 3, you see I'm at -4. I don't have enough bless points to get this bless. Once I go up to 4, I get all 4. Now there's an exception to that, and that exception is if you have 3 in all of the elemental paths. So that's like this. Then you see that now I actually have the fire that I need in order to do this. And you can see I have all of these. But if you just take 1 off, then they all go away. And that's the same for Sorcery, which are these 4. So if you have 3 in these, you can see when I get the last 3, you see all these are going to become available. Normally, you're going to need 4, right? So the second you get up to 4, you can see you get bless points available. So one of the things you can look at doing with the Rainbow is you can get 3 in all of the elemental or all of the sorcery, and that will give you a good base bless. So in this case, we'll get fire resistance, shock resistance, we'll get defense. A lot of times with the Rainbow Imprisoned, you're going to want to focus on getting non-incarnate, because the incarnate blesses are only going to become available when your pretender spawns, which is going to be pretty late in the game. And then Earth, we will get Reinvigoration and Mountain Survival. This would be a Rainbow you could get. With Pangaea, you're going to have nature mostly, and then some water. and a little bit of earth, but you're not going to have any air or fire, so this is going to help diversify you. You're still not going to have Astral, but you may decide to pick it up on your Pretender, just in case. And you can add magic weapons, and then minor magic resistance and arcane command, I guess, something like this. And then we could tank one of our scales just a tiny bit, like that. And then maybe, can we bump up? No, okay. You see we have 20 design points. With 20 design points, you can't do much with most other nations, but with this, we could go ahead and get blood, because we do have some blood on Pangaea, and with that, we can get a lot of the blood cross paths, and then we can get nature, which will give us the nature astral item, or you could get fire to get, actually fire might be better, because that gives us the fire death booster, and you can see we get to 0 design points. So this could be a rainbow pretender for Pangaea. And basically, the point of it is to have good non-incarnate blesses. The second point of it is to give you very good scales. That's why we went in prison, to free up design points to have good scales. And the final point of it is to improve the magic diversity so that you can do the important things you need to do in the late game. And this will make up for some critical weaknesses that Pangaea has. Anyway, that is the Rainbow Imprisoned Pretender. You want to get this on nations that usually will benefit the types of non-incarnate blesses you're going to get. You're going to want to think about getting this on nations that have low magic diversity, where you really benefit from getting magic diversity in the mid or late game. You're going to want to get this on nations that are not going to be overly reliant on sacreds. If they were very reliant on sacreds, it might be worth getting a full-blown incarnate bless. Instead, you're going to be relying on a mix of sacreds and other troops, and therefore you want good scales. That is the Rainbow Imprisoned. One of the problems of going Rainbow Imprisoned is they're not available in the early mid-game to get a lot of key spells off, and they're not available in the early mid-game to do a lot of site searching. So another option is, instead of going Imprisoned, you go Dormant or Awake. I think Awake, if you're going to go for a Rainbow, unless you have some very specific uses in mind, is going to be overkill. You're usually better off, I think, spending the points doing something else. But Dormant's usually a good time for these guys to come online. You're usually going to have some safe area where your Pretender can walk around and site search. You're going to have ways to spend the gems. If you go Awake and you run around site searching, which is often something you want a Rainbow Pretenders to do, you may generate a ton of gems, but you won't have any way to spend them often because you don't have any research. By the time, the end of the first year rolls around, very shortly you're going to be having good outlets to spend your gems on. I think Dormant is probably, if you're going a Rainbow, about as early as you want your Pretender to spawn. And basically it's the same thing. In this case, we might say, hey, we're going to go Dormant, so we're going to give up on Astral, and we're not going to have quite as good a scale, so we'll tank these just a little bit. We're playing Pangaea, so we don't need tons of resources, so maybe we do that. You could probably min-max this better. But anyway, this would be a Dormant build. The nice thing about this in particular would be if you had maybe a particular global that was lined up with one of the magic paths you were going to get that you thought you would be able to cast. You don't have to go 3 on a Rainbow, like especially, what are we, water? If there's a water global that we thought we could put up, we could do double defense. And then when they pop out at the end of the first year, they could cast a big water global because we've been preparing for it and researching the whole time. That is a Dormant Rainbow, which, as I was saying, is, I think, as early as you really want to go. But basically, you're going to build up a big glut of gems, so you have to have a pretty good plan on how you're going to spend them. And usually the reason that you get a Rainbow is because you don't have those magic paths on your nation anyway. And so building up a big glut of gems is usually something that is not going to pay off in the early game if you don't have the magic paths on your nation to spend those. You could probably think of some specific instances where you'd want to do this. I can't really think of any off the top of my head. But anyway, that's the Rainbow Pretender. We've got the Imprisoned and the Dormant, and then the much less chosen Awake Rainbow. Next, I'm going to talk about when you basically go Noblesse, and you're going to be focusing on scales. One way to do that is you pick, a lot of times you're going to want to pick either the Demi-Lich, because he's very cheap, or one of the Imprisoned chassis when you do this, and that is because they start off with a lot of Dominion. And Dominion is one of the things we're going to want, because we need to push our good scales all over our empire, and if you have 2 or 3 Dominion, you're not going to be able to push your scales everywhere. So having a good healthy Dominion, like 6 or 7, is kind of, par for the course. And if you have that, then you can, if you have it and it's cheap because the guy already starts off with 4 Dominion, we'll just look at it real quick. Let me just totally reset. We'll pick Agartha. You probably wouldn't do it with him either, but let's say we want to get up to Dominion 6. You can see with a Monolith, I have 240 points left over, but if I were to pick this guy, Leader of the Council, and we want to get up to Dominion 6. We're only going to have 200 points left. So even though we have more magic paths, like this guy only has 1 Earth, if we pick... Oh, dang it. If we pick a monolith and we get up to Dominion 6, we will have 3 paths at 1, and we will have more design points. So a lot of times, if you're going to go for full scales, you want to pick an immobile or the Demi-Lich. And if you do that, basically the goal is very simple. You're going to go imprisoned. You're not going to waste much on your bless, and you're going to crank the heck out of your scales. And if you do this, you can usually have almost every scale positive like this. And you can see we didn't even take a hit on temperature scales. And we have Death 6, which we could get something with it. And we could even go up to Death 7 probably and have Reforming Flesh because we're playing Agartha, and or they can twice born themselves and then come back with Sacred Chassis. And maybe that is part of our game plan. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but you could do it if you wanted to. And so we'll take a scale sit here. Like maybe luck. We don't need that much luck. Okay, anyway, so this is something you could do. And basically, the goal of this, honestly, you don't even need to do this. You can just, get rid of this. I mean, you can even go like this and say, I don't really care. Usually, if you think about it, if you're doing this, your nation is going to have some magic path that it needs. So in the case of Agartha, right, you already have Earth, you don't need that. But actually you might, because maybe you want to cast, when this guy comes out at year 3, you want to be able to cast Earthblood Deepwell, right? So his whole goal is to pop out, and the turn he pops out, he'll have 6 Earth, which is enough to cast Earthblood Deepwell, and that's the end of the story, right? And then you're also just going to add in Reinvigoration, because that's something that you can benefit from. Right, so your guys are going to be really good at casting spells. They're going to do Earth Power, and then with 3 Reinvigoration, they're going to be doing 7 Fatigue a turn. So this can be your build. But really, the Bless is totally incidental. What you're thinking about is, what is the magic path that I want, either to cover magic diversity or to cast a specific global when my Pretender comes online at the end of year 3. And those are the only thoughts you put into this, and really you're not trying to put anything into that at all. You're really just trying to maximize your scales. That is the Immobile Scales build. The Immobile Scales build is something you're going to want to get on a nation that has very good non-sacred units. It's going to be on a nation where you're not relying on sacred units, and you're just going to focus on the things that the nation already has. So generally you're going to want to do this on nations that have good enough magic diversity and that have good enough base units that you can deal with almost all the sorts of threats that are going to be thrown at you. Some particular things to consider are, how are you going to do during expansion? And then how are you going to do against player armies? And generally, player armies are going to have much more elite troops and much better mage support than you'll fight during expansion. And one particular role you need to think about is, how will your nation be able to kill elites? When somebody is running at you with Quickness Blessed, Blood Surged White Centaur, which if you haven't seen those, they're pretty damn scary. How are you going to deal with that? If you go for a scales build, like an imprisoned scales build, you need to know within your national roster what kind of troops you're going to have, or what spells you're going to have researched on your mages that are going to make that a situation that you can deal with. Because when you go for an imprisoned scales build, you have no backup plan. All you have is the troops that are within your nation. Whereas if you go with, like her, you could kit the Great Mother out, where she's just horrifying to kill, even if you're White Centaur. She's got armor and a hat on and a vine shield and a ring of regeneration on top of her regeneration she already has, and she casts regeneration on herself and temper flesh, and she's trampling all your centaur because she's size 6, and she just murders the whole battlefield, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's going to come at a cost because she's not a cheap chassis, but if you go for full scales, you don't have a backup plan like that. And the second you get rushed by somebody with Quickness, Blood Surge, White Centaur, you may have nothing you can do about it, and you just lose. So you need to be pretty thoughtful about when you decide to go for an imprisoned scales build, and you need to make sure you can deal with player elites. Okay, so now we're moving on to one of the types of pretenders I see the least, and that is the Awake Expander with scales. And basically, with this, you're going to be picking one of the expander chassis. The classic one people used to do a lot was the Earth Serpent, though he is significantly more expensive now at 220. I'm trying to look around and see what else we might get. I mean, you could do it with the Dragon too. We'll just do the Earth Serpent since it is kind of one of the best expanders. Let's say we do this. We just put 4 in it to get, some kind of basic bless. And let's say we do fire and shock resistance. Just because, it'll add it to our In this case, we're playing MA Agartha, so it'll add it to our statues and it'll make them really hard to kill. But what we're doing here is we're going to go Awake, so we can't take nearly as good a scale, so we're going to have to give up 350 design points. So we'll probably give it up something like this. We're probably going to do like a trade like that. We might take a heat pickup since we can get Magma Children, and then this is in no way min-maxed. I just thought it up in like a minute. But this is an Awake scales build. This Bless here is really just incidental. It's just because it was cheap. I could, you could get something else. Bless is incidental. What you're really doing is you're getting an Awake expander that is not going to cost much, and you're focusing on scales. And your whole goal is to find which chassis is going to be able to take one province per turn and not cost much. With the secondary consideration, if you can add to magic diversity, that would be great. So, you might try the Fire Dragon too. They're pretty good. You could probably get similar results with them. Take, a different Bless. You just go like Fire 4. Or if you are going to improve the magic diversity of your nation, that's great. What nations are you going to pick this on? The types of nations you want to pick this on, one of the hardest parts of the early game is clearing your cap circle. So like as Agartha, it's actually an issue because you have these really great units, the Shard Guard, but they take a ton of resources. So to get it where you can actually max out recruitment of Shard Guard, you need to kill all the stuff around your cap circle. And your base army actually isn't that good because you get an army full of these not that great human troops. So being able to clear out your cap circle quickly allows you to start recruiting more Shard Guard, and the more Shard Guard you get, the faster you expand. So not only are you going to be expanding more because you have your God out, which is going to be taking one province a turn for the first year, which is going to potentially give you 12 additional provinces your first year, but it's going to mean you're going to get more of your Sacred unit than you otherwise would have in the first year. Or any resource, if you're resource constrained at all, right? Even if it's not Sacred, you're going to get more of your resource intensive units in the first year than you otherwise would have. And you also have more income potentially in the first year. Even though you don't have as good a scales as a scales build, you will have much more territory. And that's because you take way more provinces. So definitely something to consider. The other thing too is it's going to be a protection if you get rushed. Let's say you were thinking about going for an imprisoned scales build with an immobile. But that, if you get rushed, you're playing with Pangaea, and they're going to do the White Centaur rush, which I've been talking about a lot for some reason. Or you're playing in Middle-Aged, and that Ashdod is going to rush you with Anakites. And as a nation, you don't really have a great answer to that. So what are you going to do? Well, okay, we need to have a particular anti-Anakite pretender god that's going to jump in and do huge amounts of damage. Yeah, and maybe it's this. Maybe it's an immortal that can run around, and it's going to be strong enough that it can kill, its weight in Anakites before it dies, and then it will respawn, and you can throw it at them again. So basically, you're going to need to do this on nations where you basically want to go scales, but you also benefit from freeing up the early game resource constraints, and from having an answer to, player elites that otherwise you might not have on that given nation. So given that, I think we've now talked about all of the major pretender categories. Now we're going to talk about how do you optimize a given pretender build. How do you think about the scales you pick is the first thing we're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about how do you optimize your bless. For optimizing your scales, you usually don't want to take less than 5 Dominion. You need to understand for your Dominion, it's going to limit how many Sacred units you can recruit. So if you're recruiting a Priest or a Holy Mage every turn, that's going to take up one of them. So in this case, if we only went 5, that would mean we could only get 4 Sacreds from our cap every turn. Now, the thing to think about is the other thing that's going to limit the number of Sacreds you can produce if you're going for a Sacred build is how many resources or recruitment points you have. So if you tank all of these to the max, you can test this out in a game, and you can see once you kind of clear up 4 provinces around your capital, how many of your Sacreds can you build with these scales in that province? And you probably don't need Dominion any higher than that. If you totally tank this because you're going for some kind of meme build, and you can only recruit, let's say, 4 Anakites, then you don't actually need a very high Dominion because you're never going to be able to recruit more than 4 Anakites from your capital. So in that case, 5 Dominion would be fine. We get our 1 commander and 4 Anakites. However, if, let's say you tank it, but you're playing a nation that has a very cheap Sacred, let's say for whatever reason we're playing Marignan and we're using Flagellants, which are very, very cheap, and our whole strategy is based on using exploding flagellants, because that's hilarious. And we want to make as many exploding flagellants as we can. We'll actually need a higher Dominion score, and that is because our recruitment of our sacreds is going to be limited not by our recruitment points or by our resources, but instead by the amount of Dominion we have in our capital, or our max Dominion strength, I'm sorry. Those are the trade-offs, and rather than giving you any kind of formula, it's more like go test it in a game, right? So you take your nation, you load up the pretender god you think, and then you start recruiting and you see what you're constrained by. Are you constrained by resources? Are you constrained by recruitment points? Or are you constrained by your sacred points? Or are you constrained by gold in general? And identifying your early game constraints is a key part to doing your pretender build. And there's no real formula, but it's more like go test it. Now, some nations are constrained by different things. Agartha likes resources a lot, so it's a lot more likely Agartha is going to be resource constrained than, say, Pangaea, where the resource constraints are not nearly as bad. You can see your centaurs are 11 resources, white centaur are 12. Right, so you don't really need a lot of resources, but you're going to need a fair amount of recruitment points because they're 29. So anyway, all that being said, nations which need more resources in general are going to need more productivity. Now, the other thing you're going to want to think about when you're doing your scales is how much money you can generate, because a lot of things affect money. Money is affected by the most powerful driver for income is going to be growth. And you can see each point is going to flip it 4. Each point of productivity or sloth is going to flip it 3. And each point of order or turmoil is going to flip it 2. Right? So this is your biggest driver. Well, okay, this is your biggest driver. It's 5. So temperature is first, then growth, then productivity, and then order. Right? These are going to be your drivers of income. There's a big caveat on the heat-cold thing. Let's say your nation starts off with heat 2. Okay, we'll just pick a nation that starts off with heat 2 so I can actually show you. Like Bandar Log likes heat 2. Right, so because we start off with heat 2, we can go up to heat 3. It'll show me an income of minus 5%. But that's only going to be 5% when our Dominion is at heat 3. What you have to consider is that for part of the year, it's going to be winter. And the fact that we're normally heat 3, it's going to get adjusted down to heat 2, or even heat 1 for a lot of the winter. And when that is the case, basically all winter long, we're not going to suffer the income malus. We'll actually get a bonus from picking this additional heat scale. And that way, in the winter, we don't pay for it. The other thing to consider is in the summer, your heat can only go up to 3. For the whole summer, we would have been at heat 3 anyway, even if we picked heat 2. So we're not going to be getting an income subtraction during the summer any more than we otherwise would have. So that being said, if you're a nation that starts off with heat 2 or cold 2, it's almost always a no-brainer to go for heat 3 or cold 3 because it's actually not nearly as much of an income hit as it shows. It's probably more like 3 or 2 in terms of overall year-long average income. One of the mistakes I think people make a lot is they trash their... Like I've talked to players who will always trash their heat or cold scales, like every time, no matter what. Or they'll play like a nation that's heat 1 and they go all the way up to heat 3, like by default. And sometimes, to be fair, you do want to do that. You know, you're a heat 1 nation, you want to free up design points for other things. So you'll go up to, heat 3. Or you're a nation that's neutral, but you need a Cancer Bless, so you're going to go heat 3 or cold 3. Like, you can totally do that. The thing to consider, though, is this is the biggest driver of your income. So if you want to go a full scales build, don't sacrifice your temperature scales that much. Now, if you're heat 2, yeah, going up to heat 3 is not going to be very expensive. But if your nation was like a neutral nation, like if we go back to, Pangaea, we have a neutral heat preference. This is a really big hit. This minus 15% is really big. So you usually don't want to do that if you can avoid it, if you want to focus on getting as much money as you can. So anyway, the first part is thinking about what are your early game constraints for either sacred production or unit production. Is it recruitment points, gold, or resources? The secondary constraint that you're trying to think about then is how do you optimize these scales for gold, given that this is the first driver, depending on the heat preferences of your nation. Growth is the second, productivity is the third, and then order turmoil is the last. Next is luck. When you think about luck, the way to think about it is there's a big synergy with order. If you take high order, you're going to have a significantly lower chance of events. Okay, that's actually not that much. It's only 6%. But there's some synergy between getting turmoil and luck because you'll get more events, and then of the events you get, they're going to be better. The other thing to consider, and this isn't obvious from looking at this, is that the types of events you get are going to be dictated by what scales you have. And a lot of the really, really bad events require you to take Misfortune. Like getting attacked by knights, or demon knights, or a bunch of other horrible, horrible things that can happen in the mid-game and really just make you unhappy, are going to be driven by Misfortune. Be careful when you get Misfortune, and conversely, a lot of the really good events in the game require you to have luck. So, yeah. Anyway, it's not just your chance of having a good or bad event, it's also the quality of the good event will be better when you take luck, and the poor quality of bad events will be worse when you take Misfortune. So, in general, though, how I like to think about this is if you take Misfortune, you're going to get attacked by indies a lot more. How good is your nation at responding to indies? If you have a very slow map move nation, then taking Misfortune is going to be painful because you may have to move troops a much longer way. Conversely, if you have a nation which is going to maybe be blood hunting everywhere, so you're patrolling all over the place, or you're going to have forts everywhere, or whatever it is, that it'll be much easier to defend against indie attacks, then taking Misfortune is much less painful. And then the other consideration, of course, is the interaction with Turmoil and Order. So anyway, that's the Misfortune scale for you. The other thing to think about is magic scales. And for magic scales, there's two effects that come from it. One is going to be how much additional research points does every single researcher in your dominion have. And in this case with Magic 3, you can see we get +3, and the other is if we get Drain 3, we get -3. And this may not seem like much, but it could be a really big deal. The other effect you get, and we're going to talk more about the research points in a minute, is if you have at least a Drain 2, you're going to get +1 MR in that dominion, friend or foe alike. So let's say if you have Undead, you may want to go Drain because your Undead will be more resistant to banishment in friendly dominion. And this doesn't require you to be sacred or anything. It's every single troop in that dominion is going to have their MR adjusted by the magic scales of that province. Likewise, let's say you're a nation that has a lot of mind hunting capabilities, like Archocephaly. You may want to have magic because if you have at least 2 magic, then every guy in your dominion is going to have -1 MR. And that becomes pretty important if you're mind hunting, because people may try to raid you and you may counter that with mind hunt. Having magic in your friendly dominion will make you a good bit more successful at mind hunting, especially if you compare +1 MR to -1 MR. So anyway, that's the MR part. If we think about the actual research point generation, let's take a look for Pangaea. For Pangaea, you're probably going to be researching with either a Dryad, which gives you 9 research points, or with the Centaur Tide, and these guys only have 7 research points. If that is the case, then if you take -3, these guys are going to go from 9 down to 6, and these guys are going to go from 7 down to a very miserable 4. And that is going to really hurt your research economy. So let's just take an example. If we go Magic 3, these guys would have 12 research points. And if we compare that to if we went Drain 3, they would have 6. So Magic 3 is going to give you twice as much research per researcher as if you went Drain. That's a huge deal. That's a big deal. And if you were to just compare 2 scenarios, in one scenario you go Sloth and Magic, well, okay, you're going to have -9% income, which is actually 20% less than the second scenario, which would be if we went 3 productivity, right? So you have 20% less income, let's say, in this scenario, but you have 3 more research points. And if we compare it now to this scenario, where I basically flip-flop them, we're going to have +9 research, or +9 income, or about 20% more income than our other scenario, but -3 research points. Well, if we're putting all of our money into research, which of course you're not, but you may be putting a large percentage of it into it, the money we put in research is going to be half as effective here, even though we're getting 20% more of it. If you're putting a large amount of your money into research, there's a strong argument to be made for going magic instead of drain, but it largely depends on who you're using to research. The higher the research points of the person you're using, the less affected you're going to be by drain scales, because this is not like a percent, it's a just +1, +3, -1, -3. So if you had 20 research points on your guys by default, then having -1 is actually not a big deal. So the better the researchers you have, the more likely it is you can go drain. And you may also have options, right? So if we were playing Pangaea and we went drain, because we wanted to get those points for a bless or whatever. We probably do not want to recruit a lot of the Centaurides to research, because 7 minus 3 is going to give us 4, which would be just horrible, horrible, horrible research. Meanwhile, 9 minus 3 is going to be 6, which is, 50% more research for each of your Dryads than for each Centaurid, which, the Dryads are also a lot more expensive, so you'd have to think about it. But anyway, that's basically the thing. The more you go into Drain, the more likely it is you're going to want to get the higher base research ability units in your army. So anyway, that is it on the research points. So now we've talked about scales. We're going to now switch to talking about the blesses. So to talk about blesses, I'm going to go ahead and max out I'm going to add enough into each of our magic paths so that we can talk about all of them. What are the different bless types you can get? And how do you think about which one you pick for your nation? Well, there is probably more here than I can cover in this particular guide, and I'm not going to try to make an extensive guide on blesses. You can find other people probably talking about what all the individual things are. I'm just going to talk about some kind of broad ways to think about it. There are a few types of blesses you can get. One of the types of blesses you can get, which are pretty common, are getting things which are going to improve the defensive capabilities of your units. The things that you would want to think about getting there are Regeneration, are things like Blood Vengeance, which if you already have regenerating units is going to make them return damage to people attacking them. You can get Berserker, which is going to keep them from running in very long fights, and it's also going to add to their protection, though it can hurt their fatigue. You can get Buckskin, which is going to be very good on a lot of units very early, particularly units that have very low base protection. You can get things like Ethereal, which is going to be very good on units that rely on defense. And it's also going to be good in games where you don't expect many people are going to be going magic weapons. Stygian Flesh, which is basically going to be the same thing as Buckskin in that it's going to give you plus 10 natural protection, except it's going to be negated by magic weapons. So again, this is probably pretty good in a game where you don't expect a lot of magic weapons. You can get magic resistance. Fortitude is very good. It's going to cut the damage you take in half. Hardskin is good. It's going to add 5 to your natural protection. This is going to be good on units with high base natural protection, where you're relying on the natural protection more than you're relying on the armor. And this will just add 5 to it, so it can be pretty good for a nation like Agartha, particularly for their statues. Then we have defense. Defense is one of the things. The way to think about defensive blesses too in general is you're either going to want to rely on protection and regenerating your HP, or not getting hit at all and relying on defense. So if you rely on defense, you usually don't want to combine defense and protection that much, because it doesn't really stack multiplicatively, it'll stack kind of additively. Whereas if you already have good protection and you bump up your protection, let's say you were using statues and they had, 20 protection and you bump it up to 25, that additional 5 is going to make it so much harder for damage to get through. They'll be essentially immune to most normal units attacking them. Whereas if you up their defense, they weren't really relying on their defense anyway to not get hit. It's not going to give them that much of an increase in survivability. So usually you want to pick between kind of not getting hit and then negating protection. You usually don't want to get both because they don't really stack super well. But regeneration is usually more useful for when you're planning on getting hit. So it's usually more useful when you're planning on getting hit for a little, like you would with a protection focus build, than you would with a defense focus build, where when you get hit, there's a good chance you might die, but you're not going to get hit very often. Things that work well with defense focus builds are things that reduce your harassed penalty, and that is things like etherealness. Like if you dodge an attack because you're ethereal, you are not going to get harassed, which will lower your defense. So defense stacks very well with things like ethereal, ethereal, and also with things like awe, which will prevent you from getting hit at all and thereby reduce your harassment penalty. So anyway, these are all things that you want to think about. Additionally, all of the resistances are going to be good for a defensive build. One thing to think about is, like, again, if we think about the Agarthan Statues, which in some ways are the epitome of defense, if you beef up their protection so they are basically invulnerable to normal weapons, then it's not that they can't be damaged, they just can't be damaged by normal weapons. And then what a smart human player would do is focus on non-normal weapon ways to damage them, like casting, elemental spells at them. So it's worth thinking too, what are the weak points? And instead of, just doubling down on, let's say, giving yourself more natural protection, it may be better to pick up elemental resistances, which will make your unit stronger. Another thing you want to think about when you're picking up resistances is battlefield-wide spells like Firestorm and Foul Vapors. Which of these spells do you think your enemy will be casting? And then, almost more importantly, which of those will you be casting? Because if you're going to be casting them at every fight, the least you can do is make sure it doesn't damage your own important troops. These are basically the defensive-oriented blesses. The other ones are Luck, which bears mentioning. Luck will strike every time where you have a chance at dying. It has a 75% chance to negate that. This is particularly good on units that have multiple forms. In some ways, it's actually kind of unbalanced in that effect, but yeah, it can be very strong. I think that's most of the things to kind of cover. You basically have things that are going to focus on defense. Quickness is going to be added to that because it will add to your defense. So does Blood Surge. And Ethereal and All are going to all be very good for a defense-focused build. For a protection-focused build, again, things like Ethereal and All will also help. It's not like there's no synergy there. There definitely is. It's just probably not as great as the synergy between those and defense. The protection bonuses synergize very, very well with any of the regeneration, since basically you get damaged a little, you heal a little, you can last essentially for forever, and then that also pairs very well with Blood Vengeance, where you take damage over time but never die, and you deal damage out over time and your enemy dies. And then, of course, there are Stygian Flesh and Barkskin, and maybe there's even another one that I'm, for whatever reason, not remembering to put on. I don't think so. Which are going to give you... Oh, Twist Fate's another one. So anyway, these are kind of the defensive blesses. Another archetype would be offensive blesses, and these are going to, again, stack with each other very well. Starting with probably the most important of the offensive blesses, which is Quickness, which will just double the number of attacks. In general, you're going to want to get this on nations which have very killy sacreds, like nations that have sacreds with 2 or more weapons. They do enjoy a Quickness buff. And then once you get a Quickness buff, you are going to probably want other things which are going to make your weapon attack stronger. Like flaming weapons or frost weapons. Frost weapons, I find it's pretty cheap, but it's also kind of not great. Poison weapons is probably the worst. Normally, if you go for a bless where you want to kill things quickly, poison weapons is kind of the definition of killing things slowly, which is usually not what you want, though maybe it would be okay on archers. You have thunder weapons. And then the problem with each of these, though, in certain cases you do want to select them, is that they basically work independent of your weapon damage. So like for flaming weapons, it's going to do a check against fire resistance, and then whatever damage is left is going to be armor piercing damage that's going to have to go through your armor. So this can get totally negated by heavily armored units. Shock weapons, it's armor negating, so you don't have to worry about that. But if they have shock resistance, it's not going to do anything. Same thing for frost weapons. In this case, it is not armor piercing, it's just 8 damage. So it gets a dice roll at the end, but it has to go through armor. If you're fighting heavily armored units, like frost weapons is not great. You then have other things which are going to increase your strength. Earth has 1, Strength of the Earth, and then Blood has 1, which is Strength of the Flesh. And both of these are going to add to your strength. They combine very well with quickness and with having multiple weapons. And they're going to make your units very, very killy. They do not act independently of your weapons. They add directly to your weapon damage, unlike flaming or thunder weapons, which is basically like a separate check against your armor. These things basically add to your original attack, so in that ways, they're kind of more effective. We have withering weapons, which this is kind of a niche use when you want to kill or damage super combatants or highly elite units, and it's kind of like something you pick up because you don't have a better thing to use your death paths for. Yeah, so it's a very situational type of thing. Coming down here, we have unholy weapons, which are also pretty good against sacreds. It does 10 AP damage. So you can think of this, it's in some ways just like the fire damage, except it is 10 instead of 6, and it doesn't do a check against fire resistance before it applies, but it only works on sacred troops. Depending who you're fighting, this can actually be pretty good. because it's going to be 10 AP damage plus a dice roll. But if you're fighting Sacreds that you expect to be very heavily armored, this might not be great because it, again, is going to be a separate check from your base damage. It's not going to add 10 damage. It's going to, your weapon's going to do damage, and then this will proc and do its own separate check against armor. But if you're fighting things that aren't going to have more than 14 armor and they're sacred, these will be pretty effective. Magic weapons is going to be good. If you're fighting troops that are going to rely on invulnerability or mist form or fog warriors or being ethereal, magic weapons is the thing. And so hopefully you know which nations those are that you would need magic weapons to counter that. Death weapons you can get. Death weapons is okay. It's 2 armor negating damage and it will also cause disease. This is probably better for fighting units that are going to have very high protection where a lot of the other weapons might not apply their damage and get through it. This 2 armor negating can. But where you don't expect they'll have particularly high magic resistance because this also is negated by MR. So I think it's pretty niche. I don't think it's great. But if you have a ton of attacks on a unit, this can stack up. So, I don't know. I think it's pretty situational and probably overpriced. But yeah, there's death weapons too. Blood Surge, of course, is one of the best of the offensive capabilities. It's going to give you 3 attack and 3 strength. Oh, and while we're on it, attack skill is great for being on the offense. Something you want to pick up if you're expecting to fight high defense units. It stacks, so you can get it multiple times. Berserker also increases your attack and your damage dealt, so that goes on the attack list as well. So anyway, I'm not sure if this is an exhaustive list of all of the offensive-oriented blesses, but it's pretty damn close. And the important thing to say about this is a lot of times there's synergy within these. Like quickness is going to make any one of these other ones better. And attack is going to make a lot of these other ones better because, for example, the more often you are to hit, the more valuable doing more damage is. Right? So if you take attack, it's going to make all of these more effective because they're going to hit more often. Likewise, if you are doing more damage, it probably makes it more likely now that you need to come up and look at attack rather than continuing to stack more and more damage. The more damage you do, the more you want to look at things like attack or quickness as ways to kind of increase your total damage output. The other thing to think about just in terms of synergy here is the faster you kill units, the less you need to worry about your defense because you're killing them all so quickly. So that is kind of one of the main thoughts behind an attack-focused build. With that, I'll say that there's some synergy between having an attack-focused build and some of the more light defense-focused builds. Like maybe you get a little bit of defense, which will, allow you to not get hit for the first couple rounds of combat before the harassment penalty gets big, and that will allow you to kind of push through and kill things with very low attrition. Similarly, Twist Fate, which blocks the first damage, the first piece of damage you take, is increasingly better the shorter the battles are, right? So if you're killing everything in a couple rounds, that Twist Fate all of a sudden could actually block or prevent a lot of your attrition if you have a very killy build on the other end. Same thing with luck. Luck is not going to help you survive a very long battle, but in a short battle, it can be very impactful. So there's some synergy here between different attack builds and then some of the shorter term defensive builds. So anyway, those are the attack blesses. And next, we're going to talk about thug builds. You may get a bless that will not really help your sacred troops, but you're more planning on using them for sacred mages or sacred thugs. Generally, the things you're going to want to get with that, because the thugs are going to be able to do a lot of stuff. The things that are kind of budget for thugs are things like fire resistance, shock resistance, cold resistance, all the resistances they like. Reinvigoration is really important on thugs. Awe can be very good on thugs. Quickness can be good on thugs too, though it's a little expensive for a thug bless. Ethereal is good on thugs, but it's expensive, so you may not want to get it. I should probably actually remove some of these. I mean, quickness and ethereal are going to be good on thugs, but they're expensive. So usually the types of things you're going to look to get on thugs are things that are not that expensive. So, awe is like right on the threshold, but awe is really good on thugs too. So that would probably stay on my thug list. But reinvigoration, really good. The auras actually are not horrible on thugs, like Chill Aura. It can actually freeze units near you, and that can be pretty useful considering it can reduce the amount of incoming damage you have. I don't think I'm going to add it. Potentially, Buckskin or Stygian Flesh can both be thug blesses, depending on which thugs you're using, because they're kind of cheap. Blood Surge is one of the better things for thugs because it will significantly increase their damage output, increase their defense, and increase their reinvigoration. All those things are kind of important for thugs. Fear is also something that can be good on thugs because fear is one of the key things thugs need. One of the main jobs of thugs is to get PD to rout, and fear is very good at that. So you may have a nation that has a very good chassis, but it doesn't have fear. And generally the job of a thug, especially a thug with fear, is just to survive long enough to get fear to cause everybody to rout. It's very expensive, but I think it deserves to be on the thug list, though you could also do fear on a different build. It is pretty expensive, though. Regeneration is also very, very good on thugs because, again, the job of a thug is normally to stick around long enough and smack things long enough that PD routes. And regeneration, if they have good base protection, can really help with that, and it can make for a very cost-efficient thug. And these are things that are kind of like, regeneration is very expensive to get on a thug. It costs 10 gems to get that on a thug. Same thing for fear. It costs 10 gems to get fear on a thug. So these are things you might consider. The resistances also are semi-expensive to get. I mean, you can get them with like a Ring of Fire or a Ring of Shock resistance, but it's also going to take a mage turn. And these are very, very cheap to get. And you can potentially stack all of them up, whereas you would normally have to maybe spend fatigue and a combat turn casting resist fire, and that would only give you 5 fire resistance if you're casting it as a spell. So anyway, these are things that all are going to be good on thugs. Let me see if there's anything else that bears particular mention. A lot of times for thugs, if I want to do a super cheap thug bless, I'll focus mostly on resistances and then maybe awe or regeneration. And then Blood Search is great whenever you can throw that in. And then depending on the type of thug chassis you're using, Reinvigoration may or may not be very important. And the final type of build you'll think about are things that are just really going to affect your battle mages. Basically, these are going to be your resistances. You don't really care about defense for your battle mages, because if they're getting hit, things are going horribly, horribly wrong. Reinvigoration is going to be very good on your mages. Precision can be good on your mages. If you're relying a lot on evocation, this precision will improve the accuracy of your mages. Again, this is only going to apply to sacred mages, though. If you're relying a lot on death or astral magic, then Arcane Finesse will increase the penetration, the spell penetration of all of your spells, which can be very good if you're relying on that. Earth, you can get fire and shock resistance combined, which this actually is kind of worth mentioning. A lot of times when you are going to need this is not the early game. You're going to need this in like the late mid game for your mages when battlefield-wide, Firestorm comes out or Wrathful Skies. So taking this on an imprisoned pretender is totally an option, and something that should be considered on nations with very good sacred mages where they want to go for like a scales build. Poison resistance is going to be very important if you're fighting a nation where you have sacred mages and you think they are going to be putting up foul vapors. Regeneration bears mention if you're a nation with sacred communion slaves. You may want regeneration because it will help them. So I think we've covered it all. Kind of a long guide at this point, but this is the other kind of archetype that you would think of for blesses. You could probably think of other categories, other things. This, I think, though, will give you a pretty well-rounded view of the different types of pretenders, how, once you pick the type of pretender, to optimize your scales, and then to go about thinking about picking your bless based on the troops you have. So anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope it's given you some ideas for different builds you could do with different nations. There's a ton of different options. I encourage you to go out there, try them in multiplayer games, and see how you do. Thank you all for watching.